could open with John Martin already in isolation, living a quiet life with his surviving daughter in a remote mountain cabin. The bitter cold of winter mirrors the emotional chill that has hardened John's heart. Snow crunches under his boots as he steps outside, looking at the valley below, aware of the wild timber wolf that has been shadowing him. For weeks, a mysterious companion in his isolation. John recalls the events that led him here, the devastating discovery of his wife's betrayal. He remembers the hospital, the unbearable pain of learning that his daughters weren't biologically his, and the heart-wrenching moment when one of them died. He had held her hand as she took her final breath, his world collapsing. The funeral had been a blur, attended by people who only knew fragments of his real life. His wife had stood there, tears streaming down her face, her guilt hidden beneath the facade of grief. In those moments, the weight of betrayal and the loss had become too much. John had vanished, helped by his old CIA contacts. He cut ties with the world, leaving behind his name, his life, and a thirst for revenge. Now, years later, he's preparing for that revenge, and the past begins to stir. The fire crackled softly as John sat at the edge of the small cabin, his mind wandering back to those dark days. The isolation suited him now, a refuge from a world that had shattered in front of him. The wind howled outside, snow falling steadily, blanketing the mountains in silence. But no matter how remote he was, the past always found a way to haunt him. It was 5 years ago when everything had come undone. John had been returning from an ordinary business trip, expecting to spend the evening with his wife and daughters. He could still remember the call that had turned his world upside down, a frantic voice telling him to rush to the hospital. Kim, his oldest daughter, was critically ill, and his wife was already there. So he remembered the sterile smell of the hospital as he arrived, his heart racing, panic setting in. The doctors told him it was genetic, something they couldn't fight. They asked about his family's medical history, but something didn't line up. John had stared at the doctor, not understanding why they were asking these questions, why they seemed confused. His wife, pale and trembling, had looked away when the truth finally slipped out. Kim and Angie weren't his biological daughters. The real father was someone else, Lou Elmo, a man John had once considered a friend, a man connected to dangerous people. The shock was paralyzing. How could he not have known? The betrayal had clawed at him, ripping his insides apart. His wife had deceived him for over a decade, pretending that their family was whole while carrying on a secret life with Ammo. The doctors had tried everything, but Kim was already too far gone. John had held her hand, the monitor beeping slower and slower until there was nothing left. But his wife had been inconsolable, but John saw her grief as something different now, a mixture of guilt and shame. So in that moment, something inside him broke. So he was off break. In the days that followed, he buried his daughter and said goodbye to the life he had known. The CIA had offered him a way out, a new identity, a clean slate. John took it, but he had one condition. He wanted to disappear, to go somewhere no one would find him. He needed time to figure out his next move, to plan his revenge. His other daughter, Angie, had chosen to come with him, leaving behind the mother who had shattered their family. Angie had seen the truth, had felt the lies unravel around them. They fled to the mountains where the air was clean and no one asked questions. It was there in the isolation that John found a kind of solace. Angie tried to make a life for herself, homeschooling and growing into a quiet, resilient young woman, but the weight of their past always loomed over them. And now, as the years passed, John was ready. His skills as a former CIA operative hadn't dulled. In fact, the isolation gave him focus. Lou Amos still lived, married into a crime family, untouchable in most people's eyes. But John had patience, and he had a plan. The timber wolf outside let out a distant howl, reminding him that even in the wilderness, danger always lurked. So that the fire crackled and Angie slept in the room next door, John knew his time for revenge was drawing near. John's eyes remained fixed on the crackling flames, but his mind was miles away, drifting back to the moment he left his former life behind. He remembered the feeling of walking out of that hospital, Angie at his side, both of them hollowed out by grief. He had arranged the funeral for Kim, but his heart wasn't in it. The truth was, nothing made sense anymore. His wife hadn't dared speak to him since that day in the hospital, and John hadn't cared. Their marriage had been dead the moment he learned the truth. It was the CIA that had come to him with an offer, one final favor in exchange for his disappearance. John's old life, his old name gone in an instant. They'd given him access to a hidden bank account, a safe house, and a new identity. In return, he provided them with information details on a drug cartel he had been investigating before everything went to hell. The arrangement worked. He'd slip into the shadows and they'd close the case. For the world, John Martin would simply vanish, lost in the haze of grief and tragedy. But even in the mountains, hidden far from prying eyes, his mind couldn't rest. There was unfinished business. Lou Amo. John had spent countless hours researching him, sifting through everything he could find. Lou had wormed his way into the local crime syndicate, married into power, and was now untouchable. Everyone knew it, but no one dared challenge him. For years, John had watched from the shadows, carefully collecting every piece of information he could find. He knew Lou's routines, his business dealings, and his weaknesses. What had started as a vague sense of revenge had become an obsession. So as the years passed, John honed his skills: covert surveillance, hacking, extracting information from digital sources. His CIA training had prepared him for many things, but this mission was personal. He wasn't doing this for any government or agency. He was doing it for Kim, for Angie, so it may be for himself. Outside, the timber wolf appeared again, moving silently along the tree line. John had first seen the wolf a few months after settling in the mountains. At first, he thought it was just another predator, but something about the wolf drew him in. The beast had kept its distance, watching him from afar, but there was a quiet understanding between them. John respected the wolf's solitude and strength. He saw himself in the animal, a lone survivor, scarred by the world but refusing to be broken by it. The wolf had been following him closely as of late, almost as if it sensed that something was about to change. So a sudden noise outside snapped John from his thoughts. He grabbed the shotgun that leaned against the cabin wall, every muscle tensing. The years of isolation had taught him never to let his guard down. Slowly, he approached the door, peeking out through the small window. The wind howled louder now, whipping up the snow, but through the haze, John could make out two figures moving toward the cabin. His heart raced, and he tightened his grip on the shotgun. It wasn't unusual to get the occasional hiker lost in the mountains, but something about these figures felt different. They weren't lost, they were deliberate. John's eyes narrowed. He opened the door a crack, the cold immediately biting at his skin. As the figures grew closer, he realized they weren't strangers. They were two women, one older, one younger, their clothes torn and covered in snow. The older one stumbled, struggling to stay upright. "Help." The younger one called out, her voice hoarse, desperation etched on her face. John stepped forward, unsure whether to lower the gun or keep his guard up. We need help. Please," the older woman gasped, collapsing into the snow. John looked at them carefully. They weren't a threat, not yet. But they had come from somewhere, and if they had enemies, those enemies might not be far behind. "Who are you?" John asked, his voice cold and sharp. "Maria?" the younger woman said. "That's my mother, Mandy. We ran from them." John lowered the gun slightly but kept his eyes fixed on the tree line, scanning the woods for any signs of movement. "Who?" he asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. "The mob, Lou Amo's men," Maria said, her voice trembling. John's blood turned to ice. John stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. Lou Amo's men. It couldn't be a coincidence that these women, battered and scared, had stumbled upon his cabin. His pulse quickened, but his face remained a mask of cold detachment. "Get inside," John ordered, his voice low but commanding. He gestured toward the cabin, stepping aside to let the women enter. Maria half-dragged her mother across the threshold, the older woman barely able to stand. John followed them in, closing the door behind him and locking it with a sharp snap. The air in the cabin was thick with tension, the fire's warmth a stark contrast to the icy dread creeping up John's spine. He kept his shotgun nearby, his eyes never leaving the women. "Sit her down by the fire," John said, nodding toward the hearth. Maria eased Mandy into a chair, her hand shan she peeled off her snow-covered jacket. Mandy was pale, her breath shallow, her lips tinged with blue. John grabbed a blanket and draped it over her, his mind still trying to piece together how they had ended up here. "We've been running for days," Maria said, her voice strained as she sat beside her mother, clutching her hands for warmth. "They found us, and they won't stop until we're dead." John's gaze hardened. He crouched beside the fire, poking at the logs to keep the flames roaring, his mind spinning through possibilities. Lou Amo's reach was far, but John had thought he'd buried himself deep enough in the mountains to avoid detection. How had these women gotten involved with Lou, and what did it mean that they'd shown up at his door? "Why are they after you?" John asked, not looking up from the fire. Maria hesitated, her eyes flicking to her mother before settling back on John. It's complicated. I don't have time for complicated," John replied sharply, standing up. "You need to tell me exactly why Lou's men are hunting you down." Maria swallowed hard, her face pale in the firelight. "My mother, Mandy, she used to be involved with them, with Louisiana's people. It was a long time ago, but they found us. She tried to leave that life behind, but they never let her go. We've been hiding for years, moving from place to place, but this time they found us, so now they want us dead." John felt a familiar burn of anger in his chest. He knew all too well how ruthless Lou could be, how he didn't let loose ends slip away. Lou Amo didn't forgive. He didn't forget. And now, John's carefully hidden sanctuary had been breached because of these women's connection to him. "So why come here?" John asked, his voice tight. Maria hesitated again, her eyes pleading. We didn't know where else to go. We were lost, and then we saw your cabin. Please, we didn't mean to drag you into this." John's jaw clenched. It was no accident they had ended up here, not with Lou's name hanging over them like a curse. But something told John there was more to this than coincidence. Lou's web was wide, and it wouldn't take much for him to find out John was still alive, waiting in the shadows. Mandy groaned softly, shifting in the chair. She opened her eyes briefly, her gaze unfocused, lips quivering as she tried to speak. He knows," she whispered, her voice barely audible. John's heart dropped. "Who knows?" "Lou," Mandy rasped. "He knows about you, John?" The room felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. John's eyes shot to Maria, his pulse hammering in his ears. She looked away, guilt flashing across her face. "We had to tell him something," Maria whispered, tears welling in her eyes. We didn't have a choice. They were going to kill us." John took a step back, his hand tightening on the shotgun. The room suddenly felt suffocating, the walls closing in on him. Lou Amo knew he was alive, knew where he was. And now everything John had worked to keep hidden, everything he had sacrificed, was unraveling. "Damn it," John muttered under his breath, pacing the cabin. He glanced out the window, scanning the tree line again for any sign of movement. If Lou's men were close, they wouldn't be far behind these women. "I should throw both of you out," John growled, turning back toward Maria. "You've led them right to me." "I'm sorry," Maria cried, her voice cracking. "But please, we didn't know what else to do. They would have killed us." John's chest tightened, the anger boiling just beneath the surface. He should have walked away, should have left this all behind when he had the chance. But now, with Lou Amo's shadow looming over him again, he knew there was no escaping what was coming. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was survival. John locked eyes with Maria. "They're coming for me now," he said, his voice ice cold. "And if they find us, none of us are getting out of this alive." John's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. The isolation he had crafted so carefully was about to come crashing down, and these women, whether they meant to or not, had brought Lou Amo's wrath to his doorstep. Years of preparation, of living off the grid, were about to unravel. He turned sharply toward Maria, his voice hard. "How long ago did you get away from them?" Maria wiped her eyes, glancing down at her mother, who was shivering under the blanket. 2 days, she said, her voice shaky. "We ran when we overheard them talking. They didn't know exactly where we were, but they were getting close. So we've been moving ever since." "Since?" Dates. John nodded slowly, the tension in his body mounting. 2 days wasn't much time, so Lou's men could already be combing through the mountains, and it wouldn't take long for them to find the cabin, when it would be ruthless, relentless, and if John's suspicions were correct, there would be no negotiating. "We need to move," John said, suddenly, his voice clipped with urgency. He walked over to a small cabinet near the fireplace and pulled out a backpack, quickly loading it with essentials, ammunition, medical supplies, and food. "What if they find us here? We're sitting ducks." Maria stood, panic creeping into her eyes. "But Mandy, she can't move like this. She's too weak." John paused, glancing at the frail woman slumped in the chair. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow, and her skin had a sickly pallor to it. It was clear she wasn't in any condition to hike through the snow-covered wilderness, but staying here was a death sentence. John's mind raced. He had to make a decision, and fast. The cabin had been his fortress for years, but it was no longer safe. The moment Lou Amo's men realized John was alive, they would stop at nothing to hunt him down. He couldn't afford any distractions. Maria and Mandy were just that distractions he didn't need. "I can't take you both," John said, his voice hard but steady. "I'll get Maria to safety, but Mandy—" "No," Maria cut in, panic flooding her voice. "You can't leave her behind. She won't survive." John glared at her, his face cold and unfeeling. "If we stay, none of us will survive." Maria's eyes filled with desperation. She grabbed his arm, her fingers trembling. "Please, we can't leave her. I'll help her, I swear. I'll do whatever it takes." John clenched his jaw, fighting back the frustration building inside him. His instincts told him to leave them both behind, to cut his losses and escape while he still could, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way Maria's eyes pleaded with him, or maybe it was the distant memory of Angie, his own daughter, looking at him with that same desperation after Kim had died, the need to protect, to save, no matter the cost. John growled under his breath, cursing himself. "Fine," he muttered, "but we need to move now." He grabbed his jacket and tossed it over his shoulder, signaling for Maria to help her mother. She scrambled to her feet, hoisting Mandy up with difficulty, but the older woman barely seemed aware of what was happening. So Mandy mumbled incoherently, her body limp, as Maria struggled to keep her upright. John quickly threw on his heavy winter gear, strapping the shotgun to his back. He pushed open the door, the cold mountain air cutting through the warmth of the cabin like a blade. Snow whipped through the trees, the storm outside growing stronger. "Stay close," John ordered as he stepped out into the storm. "And keep quiet," Maria nodded, pulling her mother close as they stumbled into the snow. The wind howled around them, biting at their exposed skin. John led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line for any signs of movement. He knew Lou's men were out there, closing in, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they came for. The alpha wolf's howl echoed through the mountains again, a low, eerie sound that sent a chill down John's spine. The wolf had been watching him for weeks, always just out of sight, and now it felt closer than ever. John quickened his pace, urging Maria forward. They had to make it to the ridge, a rocky outcrop where John had a hidden escape route planned. It wasn't far, but in this weather and with Mandy slowing them down, every second felt like an eternity. As they trudged through the snow, John's mind flickered to the thought of revenge. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. Lou Mo had taken his family, his life, so now John would take everything from him, and it would start with the blood of those coming after him. John glanced back at Maria and Mandy. They weren't ready for what was coming, but he was. The snow whipped against John's face as they pushed deeper into the mountains. Each step was a battle through knee-deep drifts, the cold biting harder with every gust of wind. He could hear Maria struggling behind him, half carrying, half dragging her mother through the storm. Mandy's breaths were shallow and labored, her frail body barely able to withstand the harsh conditions. John stopped and turned, his sharp eyes assessing their pace. They weren't going to make it like this. Mandy was slowing them down too much, and Lou Mo's men, if they were as close as John suspected, would catch up to them before they even reached the ridge. He bit back a curse, every instinct in him telling him to cut his losses. Survival was in the forefront of his mind. That's what his training had drilled into him. Eliminate the threat, minimize the risks, survive. But something gnawed at him. Maybe it was that long-buried humanity, or maybe it was the way Maria had clung to her mother with such fierce determination. He couldn't abandon them, not yet. John pushed forward, his heart pounding harder with each passing minute. His mind raced, calculating the time they had left before Lou's men closed in. The ridge was their only chance. There was a hidden cave there, deep and concealed, where they could take shelter. They'd stored supplies there years ago for emergencies just like this. It was a perfect spot to regroup and make a stand if they had to. They were halfway there when the first gunshot cracked through the stillness of the storm. John's reflexes kicked in instantly, diving into the snow and signaling for Maria to get down. "Stay low," he hissed through clenched teeth. He rolled onto his stomach, pulling his rifle off his back, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line for movement. Maria was trembling, pulling her mother into the snow as best she could, trying to shield her from the danger. So Mandy was barely conscious, her body limp and unresponsive, her face ghostly pale. John's eyes locked onto movement about 100 yards away. Dark shapes moved between the trees, careful, deliberate. They were skilled, not rushing but closing in like predators stalking their prey. He counted 3 of them, maybe more, moving in a tight formation, rifles slung across their backs. These weren't amateurs. Lou had sent professionals. John's heart pounded in his ears. He had one shot at this. If he missed, they'd know exactly where he was, and the odds would tilt in their favor. He took a deep breath, his training taking over as he aimed down the sights, fingers steady despite the freezing cold. He tracked the nearest target, watching for the perfect moment to strike. Another gunshot rang out, closer this time. They were testing him, trying to bait him into giving away his position. But John wasn't some scared civilian. He was a hunter, trained in the art of survival and killing, and he wasn't going down without a fight. He squeezed the trigger. But the crack of his rifle cut through the wind, and one of the figures in the distance dropped instantly into the snow, a clean hit, right through the chest. The others scattered, diving for cover behind the trees. "Move." John barked at Maria, his voice cold and commanding. "Go, now." Maria struggled to her feet, dragging her mother behind her as John continued to cover their retreat. He fired another shot, forcing one of Lou's men to duck behind a snow-covered boulder. But he knew they wouldn't stay pinned down for long. These men weren't easily rattled. They'd regroup and come at him harder. John backed up, keeping his eyes on the tree line, his rifle ready. He could see the other 2 circling, trying to flank him, but he had the high ground. He fired again, catching one of them in the leg, and the man crumpled into the snow with a muffled scream. But the last one was still out there, and John could feel him getting closer. "Keep moving," he shouted over his shoulder. Maria was pulling Mandy as fast as she could, but they were still too slow. John had to buy them more time. His pulse quickened as he scanned the trees, searching for the 3rd man. The wind howled louder, the storm blurring his vision, but his senses were razor sharp. He could feel the man's eyes on him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, out of the corner of his eye, John saw him a flash of movement. a shadow slipping through the trees. He swung his rifle, but before he could fire, the man shot first. The bullet grazed John's shoulder, a searing pain ripping through him. He cursed under his breath, stumbling back, but he stayed on his feet. Blood soaked through his jacket, but he didn't have time to think about the pain. He raised his rifle again and fired, his shot finding its mark. The man dropped into the snow. John gritted his teeth against the pain. They had to reach the ridge before more came. The pain from the gunshot burned through John's shoulder, but he shoved it aside, adrenaline surging through his veins. But he couldn't afford weakness. Not now. The two men were down, but he knew Luamo would have sent more than just a handful of killers. This was just the beginning. Reinforcements would be on their way, and if they didn't make it to the ridge, soon they'd be dead before nightfall. Maria, John barked, his voice hoarse. Move faster. Maria was panting, her breath coming in short, sharp gasp as she struggled to drag her mother through the snow. Mandy was barely conscious, her head lolling from side to side, her body a dead weight. Maria's eyes were wide with fear, and John could see that she was nearing her breaking point. But there was no time for sympathy. John rushed forward, grabbing Mandy under the arm and hoisting her over his good shoulder, the pain from his injury flaring. Go, he shouted, nodding toward the ridge. Don't look back. Maria stumbled forward, her legs barely cooperating as she trudged through the deep snow. John followed, his eyes constantly scanning the trees, his senses sharp, despite the gnawing ache in his body. So the timber wolf's howl echoed the mountains again, closer this time. The animal was watching them, stalking them from a distance as if it, too, was waiting for the outcome of this deadly chase. John's mind raced as they moved. The ridge was only about half a mile away, but the storm was growing worse, the snow blurring their vision and making each step harder than the last. The hidden cave at the top was their only chance of survival. It was a place even he rarely ventured to, a secret he had kept from everyone. So not even the CIA had known about it. If they could reach it, they might stand a chance at making it through the night. A sound broke through the howling wind, footsteps crunching in the snow behind them. John spun around, rifle raised, but the cold and exhaustion were slowing him down. A figure emerged from the trees, moving quickly and with purpose. This one was different from the others, more careful, more experienced. The man wore a black coat, his face hidden by a scarf and snow goggles, but John could see the calculated way he moved. His personal enforcer. And go. John hissed to Maria, pushing her forward. He tightened his grip on his rifle, his shoulder screaming in protest. He had one shot left. He couldn't miss. The enforcer moved closer, weaving between the trees, using the environment to his advantage. John's finger hovered over the trigger, his breath held. The storm was making it harder to aim, and his vision blurred with the combination of snow and pain. But he knew he had to act fast. The enforcer raised his weapon, and for a brief second, their eyes met through the falling snow. John fired. Bursts. The shot rang out, loud and final, cutting through the storm. The enforcer staggered back, clutching his side, blood staining the snow beneath him. But he didn't go down. With a grunt, the man raised his gun again, steadying his aim. John ducked just in time as the bullet whizzed past his ear. He scrambled backward, keeping low, knowing he was out of ammunition. The enforcer was limping now, but determined, his gaze locked on John. There wouldn't be another chance. John heard Maria cry out in terror, her voice raw and full of fear. He turned to see her frantically pulling her mother, desperately trying to reach the ridge. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on him. He had promised himself he wouldn't get attached, wouldn't care, but here he was, ready to risk everything for these two strangers. Get to the cave. John shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. Don't stop. With no ammo left, John grabbed the only weapon he had left, a knife strapped to his leg. He held it tightly, the blade gleaming coldly in his hand. The enforcer was closing in, his steps unsteady but persistent. John's pulse quickened, and with a surge of adrenaline, he launched himself at the man. They collided in the snow, their bodies crashing to the ground. John's shoulder screamed in agony as they rolled through the snow, fists swinging, each blow more desperate than the last. The enforcer was stronger, but John had something the man didn't, a reason to fight. They grappled, tumbling over one another, the snow blinding them both. John's hand found the enforcer's wrist, wrenching the gun free, sending it spinning into the snow. The enforcer snarled, swinging a hard fist into John's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. But John didn't relent. With a growl, he plunged the knife into the enforcer's side, twisting the blade.
The man gasped, his body seizing up as blood spilled onto the snow. John pulled the knife free, shoving the dying man off him and collapsing into the snow, gasping for breath.
The storm raged around him, the cold biting into his skin. But John forced himself to his feet. His body felt like it was on the verge of collapse, every muscle screaming in pain. But Maria and Mandy were waiting.
He stumbled toward the ridge, half dragging himself up the steep incline. Through the blinding snow, he could just make out the entrance to the cave. Maria was there, pulling her mother inside, her face pale and stricken with terror.
John reached the cave, falling to his knees as he entered. The wind howled outside, but inside it was quiet. The fire Maria had hastily started casting a faint glow on the stone walls. Lacey looked at her, blood still dripping from his shoulder, his body shaking from the cold and pain, but they had made it. For now, they were safe. So as John leaned back against the wall, exhaustion washing over him, the howl of the timber wolf echoed through the mountains once more, but this time it sounded almost protective. John closed his eyes, his grip on the knife still firm. Lou Amo might come for him. More men would follow, but he would be ready. And this time he wouldn't run.